I think a lot of the jobs that we do are the same. If you strip away all the lights and the glamour of a nightclub, it's just a warehouse with people selling overpriced liquor, right? The moment you start getting bored, it's kind of the first time they start to understand what it is you do. It's almost forecasting into the future of what happens if you don't solve this problem.
Ryan is a expert salesperson, but he also is an expert storyteller. And he brings these two worlds together to create something really powerful for his clients. Storytelling in our businesses is that it's not just this is what we do, because I think that that's what a lot of people can fall into the trap around. And so, can you get a little bit more into what that actually means?
Well, why don't I just tell you a story?
All right, so there has been a little change of plans. Episode 4 was going to be a solo cast, as all of the rest in this series are going to be. But this morning, I caught a glimpse of my boyfriend Ryan's computer screen as he was creating some content. And I was looking at what he was creating, and I was like, actually, I need to have him inside of this series because he is an expert storyteller. And I want to just like kick this off with a little bit of a story so you can get a little bit of an insight into his personality before we get into the content. When I first met Ryan, I learned that he loved professional wrestling. And it was like the weirdest thing to me as a grown man to like professional wrestling. And truthfully, it was like almost a deal breaker. Like I didn't know if I could get over it. But in learning about him and why he loves professional wrestling, it actually has become something that I find like super endearing. And that's because of the element of storytelling around that thing. And so Ryan is a expert sales person, but he also is an expert storyteller. And he brings these two worlds together to create something really powerful for his clients. And, I'm lucky enough to get front row seats to this and bounce my ideas off of him all of the time. And so I wanted to bring him into this space to add to this conversation so you guys can all learn from him and we can have a conversation today around what it takes to create really good, compelling stories that actually put you in a category of one. So, welcome, Ryan. Thank you for saying yes to this and spending this time with us.
I'm happy to be here, and I hope that there's one of your fans that like wrestling as much as I do. We'll see.
I really doubt it. I
Okay.
don't think, yeah.
All right. I'm all by myself. All
Yeah.
right. Makes sense.
All right, so let's start with the content that you were creating this morning, because that's kind of what inspired me to ask you if you'd be willing to do this. You were
Mhm.
creating a carousel post for your Instagram.
Mhm.
And when I was looking at what you were doing, I was like, oh, that's like super interesting. And the conversation you were having through that, you were bringing to light some of these big brands that are literally categories of one. And you were kind of telling a story through that around how they actually tell stories. It was like this multi-layered storytelling piece. But why don't you share with all of us like what that content piece was all about and what you were doing? And then we'll kind of go from there around how we can all apply this like storytelling to put us in a category of one.
Okay, got it. Well, I think like off the get-go, what was I doing? It's funny you say like I was watching him. What's he doing on his computer? So as I was going through it this morning, I think storytelling is one, it's complex, but two, there's a methodology behind the madness. And so one of the things that I know even for myself that I'm always working on is how do you simplify? How do you take things down from like, how do you tell a story that is very much rooted in a problem solution relationship, which I think is a lot of what you talk about,
Hmm.
that helps
We
shape.
just talked about that in episode 3, so that layers well.
Okay, there you go. So, in terms of like understanding the customer, the problem, the solution, then it's like, okay, well, how do we tell like a story for our customer in a way that is simple and to your point, compelling? And that's sometimes what the challenge is. So, what I was going through is that this morning and figuring out like the topic was around price. And so I think for a lot, when it comes to like pricing, there's a lot of different ways that you can approach it. But how can I approach it from a place of them, how they're thinking about it in their head, what's actually running through their head?
Them being
Um,
your ideal client, like your ideal client.
yeah, yeah. So how are they? Yeah, I mean, how are they thinking about it? Because I think that's one of the first things is sometimes when we want to tell stories, We see it the way we see it, but we're not seeing it the way that our client or our customer actually talks about it.
Mm-hmm.
Where are they stuck? And then how do we make comparisons? And so when I
Mm-hmm.
was talking this morning, we were going through that. It was like, I think when we look at big aspirational brands, there's a value in that to show like what everyone kind of knows. So if you think at a high level in the case of the share this morning, it was talking about price and how we don't overthink it when it comes to the bigs, aka like the Ritz-Carlton. No one's going to go up to the front desk and negotiate with price. So that's an interesting thing to include in that first piece, right? Yeah, we get that. Okay, cool. The second thing was like even things that you can understand as a consumer. So for context of that carousel, it was around that cocktail bar lounge that you go to for a drink. If they're charging 24, 25 bucks a drink, you're not overthinking that, right? No. Okay. So that's something that you've actually experienced and you experience all the time and you're very comfortable with. And then the last component was like in relation to what you're doing in your business and your competitive set, who are the people that are maybe outbidding you or outperforming, or are the people that are your ideal client or customers working with them and not you? And how are they adopting what this overarching thematic was? So in that, I'm trying to layer all those components in a story that's also simple and then bring it back to a solution through what we do, which is going back to like this story marketing sales framework. So just for context, yeah, that's what we were doing. And that's how the mind kind of runs, that you're trying to say something very simple, but you're still ticking all these boxes, which is what we're up to this morning.
Mm-hmm. And what I think is interesting about that, because when a lot of people think about storytelling, I know this is for me for sure, is like we think about stories in these big, complex, often ways, like say a movie, and it's like a 2 hour movie, or, some of the most fundamental like storytelling things follow that like hero's journey kind of pattern. And so, in this short form context that we all are working within, social media, web pages, these kinds of things, where we have to tell stories in these bite-sized moments, and they all have to be kind of cohesive, but they have to be interesting enough that they like catch people's attention. It can be difficult to actually think about, well, like, what is the story that I need to tell in this moment that's related to the broader story that I'm telling? And then how does that position me uniquely compared to everybody else who's talking about the same thing? So, when you think about working with your clients around this piece around storytelling, what are some of the things that you help them with so that they understand what are the stories that they should be telling to position themselves, what we're calling in this world, in a category of one?
Yeah, I think a lot of it first goes down to I agree with a lot what you're saying. Like, how do we get a lot in a little, right? And sometimes that's the thing. So we get caught up in like what's trendy and what's cool and what's this and what's that, and it's like all you're considering all that all the time, all the while you're still trying to create something that speaks very specific to something you're selling. So it can be really kind of confusing and overwhelming at times. To answer the question of what we do is we first have to get a good understanding of like the customer, the problem, the solution. So like who's the customer, what's their problem? And then from my end, I always look at it from like, but what's like the unique solution that only you can offer? So it sounds like you're kind of looking at it from a category. Like a lot of people say we
Mhm.
can do, there's a problem, we're hungry, where can we eat? There's a lot of people that would say, oh, we have a restaurant, we sell X, we sell Y. But what's that unique solution? So the first thing I'm always looking for is like, do they see their solution as unique? Because if it's not unique, it's really hard to tell stories that are interesting, compelling, and simple because
Mhm.
there's nothing to it.
One of the things that you say that I really love is like you actually love working with what quote unquote boring businesses. You're like,
Yeah.
I actually prefer working with these like boring, let's just say like boring businesses, like a plumbing business or something along those lines
Sure.
versus like this like sexy brand. And you've worked with both. Like in your day, you've worked with like, some big brands, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. I just want to highlight here, it's not that you need to be shiny in terms of this is what I don't think you think about it that way when you say like unique or interesting. So can you get a little bit more into what that actually means? Because I think some people will go to like, oh, I've got to be flashier versus how I think you actually think about it.
Well, why don't I just tell you a story
Hmm.
talking about stories in a world of stories. So looking at one of our clients, they're in the world of like fire protection, right?
Hmm.
So fire safety, and commercial. So not residential, but commercial. So simply put, if you don't have things up to code, you can't get insurance, you can't get proper permits and licensing. Like you can't operate a business, right?
Hmm.
And it's fairly high ticket. The challenge is though, is that there's a lot of people that are in the space. And when it comes to differentiation from a small company to a big, a lot of people think like fire safety, fire protection, it is what it is.
Hmm.
So what I'm always looking at is like I think a lot of the jobs that we do are the same. If you strip away all the lights and the glamour of a nightclub, it's just a warehouse with people selling overpriced liquor, right? Like there's nothing. So you've got to make it and you got to find what that needs to be. So for them, for example, we looked at it and I said, okay, like a lot of the way that they were marketing that story they were using a lot of products, so different gimmicks and gadgets and fire extinguishers and things like that. And they're talking a lot about like 24/7 safety and call us whenever you want and all this kind of good stuff. And I was just sitting there and I was asking the client, I was like, just paint me the picture of what happens when you get these phone calls from these people and when stuff's hit the fan and what it looks like. And he was telling the story about something half on fire and blah, blah, blah. And I said, how come in none of the creative or any of your marketing material, is there anything that looks like a building is on fire going down? And they go, well, we want to alleviate that. So we want to talk about that not happening. And I
Hmm.
was like, yeah, but for them to really feel that pain, it's almost forecasting into the future of what happens if you don't solve this problem. So I just kind of came, and this is how I kind of riff
Yeah.
with an idea, is I'll just go, okay, we're there for 24/7 service, call us when you need us. Or I just thought, what if you had something that said, you see this, we make sure that this doesn't happen to buildings that you own. And it was just kind of like, okay, what does that mean? And then we started to further it down to like, this is probably what you don't want to have happen, and we make sure that it doesn't.
Hmm.
And that's kind of where we start to riff and the story comes, and then we backfill with calls
Yeah.
to actions.
Because
But
now there, I can
yeah.
just think of all the different like narratives that you could come up with around that, in terms of it's a much more emotive, which I think is like the purpose of storytelling in our businesses is that it's not just this is what we do, because I
Mhm.
think that that's what a lot of people can fall into the trap around, especially
Sure.
when I talked about this in the last episode, is like we fall into these like credential
Mm.
traps or we fall into our methodology trap and we start talking about the what
Mhm.
versus really like activating the emotions inside of our ideal client and creating a story that they can see themselves in.
Yeah, and I think one that avoids this pain, like we've all heard that idea, is that like, you're going to sell more if you saw somebody and they were, again, I use that word forecasting. What happens if we do nothing? And
Mhm.
you can utilize that in a lot of different ways. You can, in a fire protection thing, you can utilize it in a thing like if somebody was trying to get in shape or they felt like, hey, you know what, I'm not that. Let's just paint me this picture in 24 months of what happens. And the more time that we can sit thinking about what happens if our customer or client doesn't receive the help they need? Those stories start to just naturally come to you because that's where that idea of being a guide or someone who's there to solve the problem kind of takes form. So my thing is always like, let's not talk about selling the dream. A lot of products sell like have the beer on the beach and whatever. Think about it from the lens of like what happens if this problem isn't solved. And if we can lay more into that, it allows you to come up with a much more compelling or compelling ways to really garner the attention of the people that you're trying to help and ultimately.
Yeah, I hear that. And I think for a lot of people that are listening to this, that's a really good thing to just notice because I think I know for myself, because I actually don't agree with the piece that that is a better story to tell than painting the dream. I think we have two choices when it comes to storytelling. And I think we actually need to do both in our brand. And we actually need to know our ideal client enough to know what motivates them. So there's going to be some people where painting the like disaster scenario and avoiding that actually isn't going to be as motivating as painting the picture of like the desire. And we can see this in different brands, right? In terms of a lot of luxury brands specifically, we have it's more desire based, right? Like you and I talk about Nespresso all the time because a couple years ago, Ryan and I, or maybe a year ago, we got an espresso machine in our house. And like before George Clooney got like partnered up with Nespresso. Nespresso was like a shitty brand. Like it was like not premium at all. And then now you go into the boutiques in the in Park Royal Mall, and it's like very fancy, and it's a whole experience. And then George Clooney's like partnered with it, and it's actually painting this picture of who you become and who you are when you drink Nespresso. So I just want to say that because I think there are the two sides to it, but I do think that most people way too far or like lean too far on just that side of things, where I do think that there are powerful stories to tell on the side that you're talking about.
Outside of the George stuff, if we can like look at it and think like sometimes what people get caught up in, and I have to work with our clients a lot on this, is they go like, I don't want to sound negative, or we're not like a negative brand or company. And it's like, but this is the catch. If there's no problem to be solved, there's no solution to really be bought. Can we agree on that? Yes. Okay. We have the opportunity here to then be that guide, that helper to provide that solution. So again, it is a case by case thing
Hmm.
in terms of industry, sector, culture, all those things have to be. But I would say that again, in that catching of that, just because if you look at any great movie, getting to that spot, they have to go through some sort of turmoil to get there. Otherwise, if it's just happy go lucky from the start, you get pretty bored. So there's
Yeah.
got to be a bit of struggle, a bit of pain, and then there's some resolution, just like they do in the old WWF.
Always comes back to
It
wrestling.
always goes back to wrestling, man. I mean, this whole thing is all wrestling.
Yeah. Okay. So one of the things that we chat about often, or not often, but it comes up, and we both love this kind of stuff. So, we're weird. We talk about this at like 6 a.m. in the morning. But around some of these like big brands that have these really cool stories that became, you can call it like all like almost like cult like or movements, and people really rallied behind, and really it became really interesting, and it became a story that almost created a world of its own. And you
Mm.
had mentioned, I can't remember the example now, but it was that you had a tagline. Do you know what I'm speaking about? There's something in your pocket.
It was just talking about, again, when we think about stories, sometimes we think we have to, they inform a lot of communication like that we use, that we can speak in sound bites or use for taglines or whatever. But I asked you, I said, 1,000 songs in your pocket. Do you remember who that was? And you're like, no. And I was like, that's the iPod. And you're like,
Hmm.
oh yeah. And I was like, and that phrase, that shaping that story and telling that sold like 15 million iPods.
Hmm.
It was very
Yeah.
simple for people to understand. They weren't saying taking this technological product that had CDs and this into something into your thing. It's like, there's 1,000 songs in your pocket, man.
Which is
So,
really cool. And I think that that's why I wanted to bring that up, is it was like one central story where the user was the hero, right? That it was the person who was having, and again, this was solving for a desire problem, not a pain
mhm.
point problem, but a desire of accessibility and freedom. And now I remember the ads, and it was like the person actually with these kind of headphones, like walking down the street. And like so wild, right? How long ago that was. And that still image, I can see it. I can
Yeah.
feel it. And so the thing that I wanted to bring in here is that it was one story that was the centralized idea, then all of these like other kind of stories or applications of it. Well, what would that look like visually? What would that look like, in terms of like how would that person be interacting with this story? And then they
Yeah.
could build out like a whole world around that. And the reason why I want to bring this up is I think that many people, including myself, are like, well, what is my story? What is the centralized idea? What are the stories that I could be telling? So what's your advice for people on that? How to start to identify what the
Mhm.
story is, and then how to start to bring that to life.
Well, I think what's interesting about the Apple thing there is that it's not your story, it's the customer's story or the client's story.
Yes.
There's a massive distinction there. And I think for a lot of the times we'll talk about being fourth, probably not fifth generation. That'd be too old. 28-year generation. But it's like we've done this, you talked a lot about the credential stuff earlier, right? It's like no one gets out of bed and they're like, I'm looking for someone that's been around for 3 generations. No, they're thinking about a problem that's in their head. So when you're
Mhm.
first thinking about your story, you really have to think about it through the lens of like the customer or the client has the problem. We have this solution. They are the hero, we are the guide. They are the
Hmm.
hero, we are the guide. And sometimes we can get caught up in thinking about telling our own story. And it's kind of like having a conversation with someone who just won't stop talking about themselves. We kind of tune it out or we don't even really spend much time with it. So to
Hmm.
identify what it is, first and foremost, that's a huge distinction. It sounds simple, but it's a massive distinction.
Hmm.
The other thing there around that is like how your client or customer talks about it. So we use that a lot. Like, what's the customer voice? You can say a
Hmm.
lot of the same things differently, and they can resonate or not resonate purely based on that. You know
Hmm.
what I mean? And so, how they talk is massively important to filter that story down and be like, okay, but in this story, how are they feeling? How are they seeing it? What's the lens that they're seeing the problem through so that
Yeah.
we can communicate in a very simple way? And I always try to bring it back to like if somebody was in need, if somebody that you loved or cared for was in need, how would you talk to them?
Hmm.
On certain items, you'd probably be a little bit more authoritative and strong. Don't go into that. You'll burn your hand, you'll drown, whatever. You other stuff, you would talk a little bit more around like you'd lean in and you'd say, like, tell me how you feel, or like,
Hmm.
what are we going to do about that? So starting to use that language and trying to think about it through in conversation and coming through the client or the customer's voice,
Yeah.
is super important. And then the last thing that I would say in that is when you're thinking about stories and you're writing or you're typing, say them out loud to yourself. Things hit way differently or don't in between what is typed or versus what is written versus what is said. Because the thing that I want to bring that back to is you always want to think like, if you said that, hey, what is that thing? Dude, it's 1,000 songs in your pocket. You'd be like, I
Hmm.
get it. I understand. It solves the problem. It's easy in everyday language. So not only do you have to be speaking their language, you have to say those things. So if you can tie it back to that, like they are the hero, we're the guide, we're guiding them. How are
Yeah.
they talking and seeing the problem? And then when we're going through some of this, would we actually like say it to yourself and say it out loud and see if it would register?
Hmm. Yeah. Okay, cool. And then for specifics, like if we were to look at, I think something that often comes up for people is that, there's a lot of people in my space is something. It's like a lot of people doing similar things. And I
Mhm,
know like a big part of your work is helping companies who are, you call it like playing to win,
mhm,
become like the obvious choice, like in their space.
mhm.
So when you are like, if when that's the goal for someone, because I think that a lot of the people listening to this are in a similar boat. We're just talking about it as building a legacy level business, defining your category of one.
Sure.
What is the most important thing to nail when it comes to the story that you're telling?
That's a good question. The moment you start getting bored, it's kind of the first time they start to understand what it is you do.
Oh, that's good. Yeah. Yeah.
And so when you think about that, when I say the thing, just do it, who comes to mind?
Yeah. Nike, obviously.
They've been
Yeah.
saying that for how long? Do you know the origin story, how that even came to be?
I don't know. Even though I've
No.
watched that movie and I don't know if it was in there.
Well, with some guy in a line that needed to get executed, but that's a little negative.
Oh,
But the problem,
oh,
and he said, just do it. And then someone heard that, and then somehow it translated into,
really?
yeah,
Okay,
went
that's
into it.
interesting.
No one
Yeah.
would think that's how it came. But they've been telling the same story forever. The way they tell that story is different relative
Mm-hmm.
to the times, relative to the solution, aka the product that they're selling, or in your case, the service that they're selling.
Mm-hmm.
I think one thing that I would bring it back to is we creatively, and I struggle with this myself a lot, as you know, is like when it's your baby and when you spend so much time with it and you're excited and you're passionate, you want to tell the world about it. You
Mm-hmm.
know what I mean? You're like, you don't just say, hey, this is my baby. Its name is Greg. Moving on with the conversation, you're like continuously talking about how perfect and different and unique and this. It's the same thing with whatever it is that you're selling or offering.
Yeah.
And so you got to really find what that through line is because just do it can then mean so many things and how they articulate that through different marketing channels and mediums and whatever the case. So I would say like that idea is like when you're starting to get bored with it, but you know it's good, stay with that because
Hmm.
the root story doesn't have to change. It's how you tell that
Yeah.
story that's going to change with the times relevant to what your client or customer is looking for in those moments.
Yeah. I had no idea what you were going to say there. And I love that you went there because I think that is so, so key is that we get bored or we think it's boring or repetitive or we're like, no one's listening. So we start changing it up. And now, like, it starts to turn into this, like, you're a musician also, is like, and what I'm visualizing is like, you've got all these songs, tracks going on at the same time. And it gets very confusing for people. It gets very noisy. And I actually was on a client call the other day, and there was the team on this call,
Yeah.
and there was like her marketing lead, and her marketing lead was saying that now the number of touch points that people need to have inside. Now we're getting into the sales conversation a little bit, but the number of touch points that people need inside of a sales funnel has gone up to 11 to 13. So it used to be seven, right? It was kind of like the magic number. Now it's
Sure.
almost double. And so, that kind of, I don't know exactly why. My guess is that it's because of like of all the information and so much content out there that it starts to like our signal is getting quieter and quieter, even if we're playing the same song at the same volume. So we
Mhm.
just need to have more touch points with people. And the more simple we keep our story, our song, and they just hear it over and over again, that's when it starts to break through the noise. So I think that's a really helpful connection to make, especially between this idea where your zone of genius is this
Mhm.
intersection between storytelling and sales.
Yeah, and on that, a quick, again, we were laughing about the wrestling thing or these movies, these films, like I always laugh to you and say, I got like a Batman complex that why do they keep making this movie? Like, how can they keep making the same thing they've been making since the 60s? It's because the story we see ourselves in, and as things change, they shape it in different ways, but it still resonates because it's a great, simple, clear story.
Hmm.
It's the same thing with a band talking about music, AC/DC, and this was a Rolling Stone article, and they brought out a new album years ago. And some guy at the table, someone that was writing the story said, "Hey, I just want to let you know, like this sounds a lot like the last album." And I don't know if who brought was it Brian Johnson or some brought him in and just said, "Hey, like I don't know if you know, but we've been making the same album 20 times over."
Yeah.
So
And the secret behind it all is like, I don't know if you know, but this is what's going on.
yeah, so
Yeah.
there's something about that again, it almost seems too simple, but that's the goal is keeping it simple so that we're not changing and overloading people's brains with what it is that we're trying to say.
Yeah, that's great. Well, it's a great place to end, I think, in terms of this little cameo you did with us. So thank you so
Yeah.
much for coming in.
It was a big trek. So,
Yeah, I know. I always want to leave people with actionable takeaways because, listening to a conversation like this is great. And then it's like, what do they do with it? So
mhm.
for someone who is thinking about their category of one and not just like not just like fucking around with it, but like actually going all in on like claiming it, playing to win using your words. What's something actionable that they can take out of our conversation today, and play with, experiment with, try on?
I would say for those that are already have a good client or customer base, there's always those people that you work with that you're like, they're kind of the ones your favorites, right? You have a good relationship with, you've worked with them long standing. I would ask them when it comes to the story that if you had to sum up my story, if you had to sum up our story, if you had to sum up the story of what we've been able to do together to help solve that problem, tell me what would that be? And
Mm,
then ask three or four or how many people that you've got, and then see how connected that is to the way that you see it. And in that, you're going to find some of the similarities or the disconnects that you can
mhm.
shape and that. And hopefully there's a grounding that you're not distinctly, massively different. But I think
Yeah.
seeing where that registers is a really great way to just say, hey, you know what? I know we've been working together for a while and it's been a bit of an awesome journey here. If you had to paint the picture and tell the story of what we've done, what would you say? And
Hmm.
then ask that from those that you care about and trust, and then bring that home to the creative room and see how that's connected with how you want to be or trying to tell your story and take it from there.
Yeah, that's super. And it's a really great thing. I'm going to even try that on myself because it's often those mirrors that we need to reflect back what we can't see, right? The things that we do that are so normal to us and just like, oh, yeah, that's just, we're not even aware of them because it's just innate in how we operate and how we move and our energetics that we can't see it. So, getting that reflection back is really helpful. All right, so we're going to wrap that there. Thank you so much. We're going to share all of Ryan's info in the bottom of the show notes for those of you that are listening to this in the podcast so you can connect with him, learn more about his philosophy and ways of creating these really powerful stories that then turn into sales, because that's obviously the point in this context anyways. Okay, thank you so much, Ryan, and we'll see you all in the next episode, episode number 5 in this podcast series.